Hello and welcome to the Hobby Breakfast Show. It is your host Onod, and I am not joined by OT and Matt today for reasons, trademark. Just me. We're going to be running through something which I've been working on a little bit on the channel sort of over the last couple of weeks, and it's going to be with the aim of just kind of examining who is playing Middle-earth at the moment. Not really going to actually answer that question, so feel free to click off the video now, I guess, if you were expecting an actual answer. It's more just looking at a few polls that we ran on the channel and just kind of thinking about what people are currently saying in the community. Obviously, at the time of publication, there's quite a lot of frustration with Games Workshop not releasing things or not being quick enough to do stuff that people with a particular mindset want. And we're just going to kind of have a look at some stuff and just think about, I guess, who people that are playing Middle-earth are, and does everyone think the same thing? And spoilers, people don't all think the same thing. So just before we begin, some important things to say. The data that I have gathered for this video is inherently flawed. It is not going to be a completely accurate take on what people actually think because many reasons. Small sample size. Only really people who are likely to be subscribed to the channel probably answered. Might not be a representation of everyone who plays Middle-earth. Not saying that our subscribers are weird outcasts, but you do listen to us, so maybe you should think about that. YouTube polls are just not great. They've gotten even worse recently. You can only have 4 answers. You used to be able to have 5, but presumably Google have run out of internet space, and results may have been skewed by people answering just to see the results on YouTube. This is something that I am guilty of doing on other people's content because I want to see how many nerds think that a 40k thing is something. So I just answer a poll so I can see how many people have answered it. And then my answer is not truthful. But anyway, with all of that to say that what we're about to talk about is a load of rubbish, let's talk about some other things. This was a question which I asked, which was essentially saying to people, what's your interest in the game like at the moment? The current edition, are you more interested in it than last edition or less interested? I deliberately didn't give people a I'm equally interested option. Someone in the comments did say, well, I am equally interested. And yeah, but I didn't want to give people like an easy out. I wanted a decision. And I thought the data from 59 responses at the time that I'm recording this was very interesting. 2/3 of respondents said that they were more interested in the current edition compared with the last edition. And I have to say, I was surprised at that number. I personally probably am slightly less interested. The direction the game's gone in, I don't really feel like it's tailoring to kind of what I, at the end of last edition, was interested in doing, which was kind of like the narrative, thematic, building wacky army lists, sort of like what if ideas to do with lore, or like I was looking at building like 4th age armies. I know Mayor was thinking about doing that as well for like a dwarf elf list that he had always been talking about, and that the new edition kind of just, that's no longer really part of the game. But actually more people are interested in it that answer this survey. In terms of some analysis of this data, it may not actually be representative, but 59 responses, Middle-earth, the community is not going to be vast. It probably does give you actually a good indication that despite the fact that most of the loud and frequent comments occurring on the internet are kind of negative, most people are probably actually enjoying playing this edition, are more interested in the game, are eager to see what happens, maybe a little bit frustrated at some of the wait times, but it's not stopping people this month answering a poll saying that they're still interested. and that they're still more interested. I did think, is 34% high? It may be, something which, if I had the means to, looking at other games, shifts between editions to see whether that's a normal amount. But we just don't know. In terms of for Games Workshop as a business, would they consider a third of players becoming less interested as like an acceptable kind of thing for Switch and editions? Possibly. But if you're getting 2/3 of your player base more interested than they already were, that sounds like probably a good thing overall. I think it's pretty clear to say that people like me who are bothered by the lack of narrative support or that sort of thing are clearly in the minority. I know that it's something me and OT have talked about in terms of like the loss of narrative and thematic game support, or at least our feeling that it's all disappearing. It's been shunted to like, here's a free online PDF of a scenario that we haven't really changed or balanced or tweaked or anything. And that's about it. Most people though, who are presumably just playing match play, tournaments, pickup games, whatever, they seem fine with it. And the new army building, which I think is the thing which everyone is always talking about, or we don't like it, or it's too restrictive, doesn't feel like I'm actually building an army, I'm just taking the same as everyone else, I'm just picking a list. But the reality seems to be that it isn't really driving that many people's interest away, or at least in this poll, it's not. Most people seem to still be interested, more interested, excited to see where it goes. That seems to be the general vibe from the majority of players. So that was really, really interesting in terms of reading through that. I then asked a follow-up question, and I said, when did you start Middle-earth? When was the first edition you played in, essentially? My thought process was kind of going, well, this is, interesting. Is it that the reason that people are more excited is because most of them old players who are excited about, some sort of shift in the rules? I just sort of thought it'd be interesting to see when people answered. I think this was one of the more interesting results, actually. 72 responses, so a few more answered this. And it's pretty clear from this, and I would be willing to say that this is actually probably more or less representative, actually, of the wider player base, just because it's so massively clear that there are two main points where people started that it seems unlikely that it would change. And I basically said, did you start in the Lord of the Rings era, so with the original films or with the Blue Book? I had wanted to split those into two, but I only had 4 options, so unfortunately wasn't able to be a bit more precise. So did you start with the very original films, or did you start then in the years between the films and The Hobbit? I would have liked to have asked that, but unfortunately not. Did you start with The Hobbit and that edition? Did you start with the 2018 edition? And did you start with the 2024 edition? Like, how many people answering this poll are completely new? The biggest group of players were the 2018 edition, which I was really interested in. And I think that there's a lot of things that we could speculate and discuss, and we'll get on to some analysis in just a second of what that potentially means. The second biggest were the people who joined with the original Lord of the Rings, 40%, big turnout. The smallest group of players were the Hobbit era. The Hobbit clearly had either just no one really started the game with the Hobbit, or at least not enough that it's noticeably dented the player base, or people who started in this era did not stick around. Perhaps we just haven't reached the point in people's lives where the Hobbit is nostalgic enough that people return to wargaming, because I know a lot of players who return to Lord of the Rings because they've reached that point in their life. So that's possible, but that is a massive drop. It's essentially like 2 people have ticked that box. They started then. And then interestingly, 7% of people have started playing in the last 4 months. That's actually, I think, quite high in terms of a proportion, because most people you'd imagine would have started 2018 and maybe played a few games over the last year. But actually, it seems like a fair few people have bought into this new edition. And I think it's probably also worth pointing out that we are not one of the big SBG channels. We're probably not the first in people's search bar. So for this poll to have found new people is interesting in and of itself. So let's do a bit of analysis on what this potentially could mean. The people, the 40%, I am kind of going to term them as essentially like lifetime players. If you're still playing a game 20 years after you potentially started, I think there's a good chance that you are a customer, player, enthusiast for life. That you are in some form, even if you're not maybe buying all the releases, you are following news, you are always going to be tempted. Games Workshop drops a model, that person knows it's there, they're tempted to buy it at least. In terms of the 2018 players, then those brand new players, and I think it is probably worth pointing out that maybe people played like once when they were, back in the day, but they didn't really feel like that warranted answering this question that way. Fair enough. But anyway, such a huge number of players joining in 2018 really caught my attention, and I wanted to draw out the difference between the Hobbit edition and the 2018 edition. Then why have we got such a drastic difference? And no real answer to that, of course, but a lot of people I think would respond with the kind of response of, well, the Hobbit films flopped, so people didn't buy into the game because they didn't watch the films. And I think that is a relevant piece of analysis, but if you were comparing that with the 40% of players who started with Lord of the Rings, that makes complete sense. The 2018 player base started off the back of no new films. They just started the game because somebody released a game based around a film franchise that was 15 to 5 years old. And they went, yeah, I would actually quite like to play that. So they were drawn in by it regardless of how old the films actually are. And we often think of Lord of the Rings as having that like big buy-in with the films, but actually our current player base are new players. That is the majority. Okay, 57% of people have started, according to this poll, since 2018. Now, obviously, this poll is going to be skewed, but I think it's safe to say that this would indicate that in the wider player base, a large proportion of them are new. Why then is that the case? And I've kind of drawn out a few conclusions from this. The amount of support Games Workshop was offering from between 2018 to 2024 has to have played an effect. Games Workshop were giving the game content, meaningful content, Legendary Legions for competitive play, thematic, more narrative stuff, which they hadn't done, or they were actually updating it, new models that people actually wanted, I think, importantly, for factions that they liked, bringing back old models that people wanted, that collectors wanted. These surely elements of support must have been a factor. I think another key thing was the value of the starter set. That starter set, people who didn't play Middle-earth, who maybe played other Games Workshop games, I can remember watching YouTube videos amidst the anecdotal evidence of people saying what great value it was. The models were old. Okay, you got a new Theoden, but sure, the rest were old in that Pelennor box. But you got value, and you got to buy into a game which everyone said was a really, really good game. People promote Middle-earth. They may not necessarily play it anymore, but a lot of people say, I remember this game being one of the better ones Games Workshop did. It's a really great product. It's still based around those core rules by Rick Priestley that people remember being good. So I think that must have been a factor as well. I think as well that Middle-earth is buying into something that Games Workshop has started doing over the last half a decade. Old World would be a good example of this, like nostalgia bait. Here is something that people feel nostalgic for. It's tapping into that market of people who now have a lot of disposable income, who maybe didn't have the money to buy all of the stuff that they wanted. But now, as it's becoming a more viable hobby, I guess, for adults, and I think reality is wargamers are now probably more adults they're focusing on rather than children. They're looking at that like 20-year-old market who can spend a lot of money on a lot of plastic Space Marines, but some of them are going to be drawn into Lord of the Rings, and you're tapping into a group of players you wouldn't otherwise get. And we'll get onto that in a second because this links to the final poll I did. But finally, then, the final thing I can think of, I think also it's relevant to point out that there's a kind of rising tide idea. Games Workshop blew up around the pandemic with the launch of the new Space Marines at the same time that this edition was released. People who are drawn into understanding then what wargaming is and want to start it or want to start a new game, they are drawn into Games Workshop, and then they see there's a Lord of the Rings product, and so they're then drawn into this. And I think that is a definite factor there. In terms then of who these new players are, and I think this is important, if you started the game in 2018, what is your view of the community? You are viewing a community that's largely driven by match play, tournaments, and that kind of stuff. The discourse online is about competitive stuff. Most podcasts are talking about how to win. They're talking about tournaments they've been to. They're analyzing lists and telling you why they could be better, why you don't want to put certain units in lists. That is kind of how people have been taught to play the game. And Games Workshop has done this too. Games Workshop has kind of, with the constant FAQs, told you that the way to play the game is to be competitive, to focus on rules, to play rules as written, and all of this sort of stuff, to use the Legendary Legions, use these new powerful combinations, and so on. In terms then of that being an impact, you can potentially see why people are not that bothered about why narrative stuff's been dropped. And the people who are interested in narrative, I guess you could argue, have already played the narrative scenarios now. Is there, though, a group of players within the community who have not played those narrative scenarios and just don't really have a way of doing it? There must be. Maybe I'm being optimistic because that's what I want to think, but there must be a case there that the new players being drawn in are being pushed in a certain direction, and Games Workshop games at the moment are tending to all push them in that direction. All of that, the discourse is about it. I think it's also worth pointing out a lot of people clearly aren't driven away from the game by old miniatures or working with resin or metal. A lot of people you see online complaining about the look of the miniatures. Do they hold up? Not as well as modern miniatures. Do modern miniatures have their downsides though, like having to build fiddly stuff for new players? Yeah. Do the old miniatures look terrible? No, most of them don't. They might have less detail, but they look like what you see in the films for the most part. Huge amount of the player base is now only used to Games Workshop's insane release cycle. Probably explains why a lot of people get frustrated about having to wait a few months for new stuff. It is frustrating, but you can see why so many people are expecting something different because they see 40k and whatever, get that. And also, I think there's worth pointing out that those players who maybe are more used to good versus evil as the way that the game was intended, you don't really get that too frequent anymore. Most people view it as you just play whatever army against whatever army, admittedly something that I do in a one-off game. It's interesting that that's kind of dropped out of even the conversation. So few tournaments do it now. It's not really a focus. People aren't focusing on a thematic what-if game. They're focusing on, here's a specific moment that my army represents, and then I just want to use that to try and beat whatever my opponent has. That's how people play, and that's what they've catered for. The final poll then, what are players' other main war game? I actually, in the question said, what game do you play or have you played as the most alongside Middle-earth, essentially? At the time that I am recording then, 67 responses. 33% only play Middle-earth, which is kind of crazy, I think. especially when you think about other games. I could maybe imagine 40k having a really exclusive player base. Other games, though, if you are into non-Games Workshop games, you probably play a couple different games. If you're into historicals, you definitely play different systems. If you are into some of the more niche Games Workshop games, you might play others. Perhaps it is just the case that all games have a core player base who are just always only going to play that game. But I did think 33% sounded at least quite high. And I think the interesting thing, jumping ahead to some initial sort of thoughts I've had on this, that's 33% of people who Games Workshop wouldn't have as customers. It's going to be a small group of people ultimately, but it is interesting just thinking about Games Workshop's business model. They have so many games that even if you only play one, the chances of them producing a game you're interested in are so high now because they cover and tick so many different boxes. Do you like old fantasy? Do you like new fantasy? Do you like skirmish fantasy? Do you like sci-fi? Do you like grungy sci-fi like Necromunda? Do you like Spec Ops? Do you like the board games? Do you like Blood Bowl? Like, they just give you so many options that they don't need you to necessarily go and play every system. I don't actually think that Games Workshop are trying to make people play other games necessarily. In fact, they're actually trying to make it so that your models don't work in other systems. So they're making it more difficult for your Horus Heresy models to work in 40k, for example. They kind of are happy to capture an individual market for each game, or at least that's my interpretation of what's happening there. So yeah, 33%, really interesting. 16% 40k or Age of Sigmar. And this idea that some people I've heard say that people are fed up with 40k and they're moving into Middle Earth. Perhaps that number backs that up. If we are saying that potentially as many as 1 in 6 Middle Earth players playing 40k or used to, then maybe that kind of supports that idea. I don't know whether I was really expecting that number to be higher or not, to be honest. I think just because it's such a popular game, you'd inevitably expect some people to have it as their sort of second or first game, the one that they play most alongside Middle Earth. But yeah, interesting. Another Games Workshop game, 21%. I do think it's interesting that Middle Earth players are drawn to not Games Workshop's main games. I feel like there are a group of people, myself I guess included, who like Games Workshop games but don't like the big ones because they're put off by 40k or AOS, which tend to be a bit more expensive, tend to be a bit less fun to play, dare I say it, and kind of just don't like all the release, every 3 years having to replace all your stuff when it's, focusing on cheaper games. So I do think that's interesting that Middle Earth players are more likely to be playing Blood Bowl, whatever, than 40k by the looks of admittedly a very small number. And then non-Games Workshop games. So almost as many people say that their other favourite gaming system is a non-Games Workshop game as it is just play Middle Earth. And I guess that makes sense in terms of people being drawn in by a specific IP. Are they likely also to be people who are into Star Wars, for example? Or are they people who are likely to be into a game which is similar in feeling to Lord of the Rings, perhaps? So whatever the case, interesting, I thought, and especially that number about only Middle Earth then. Could we make the analysis that the draw of the game is more to the IP than whatever Games Workshop does to an extent? Could Games Workshop do whatever they like? No, I think that their decisions do matter, but I think clearly more people are going to be interested in Middle Earth than are going to be interested in Games Workshop of this player base, potentially, we might argue. And then the third of people not getting drawn into wider wargaming. Why is that? Why are a third of the player base content only playing Middle Earth? Look at all of the other gaming systems and just, it's not for them. Perhaps this is just like the draw of Tolkien. that people love Lord of the Rings so much that they wouldn't really be wargamers otherwise, but they are exclusively because it's Middle Earth? Is it just that they don't have time? Is it that they don't spend that much more money? I don't know, but I think it is interesting that Games Workshop are not getting 33% of player bases to play other games. Do they care? I think probably not. They're making their money by you buy Middle Earth. But also that group of players are equally not going and buying other systems from different manufacturers too. So clearly there are people that Games Workshop are getting money for Middle Earth and nothing else. Anyway, that was a look through some information on people playing the game at the moment and some things that they have answered on those polls. If you have any thoughts, stick it in the comments. I'm interested to hear what people's analysis of that data is, what people's thoughts might be. We will at some point be back with another video. I think that by the time you're listening to this, we will have probably missed this month's pod, but we will be back soonish. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe or don't if you don't want to, and we will catch you next time.